Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to start the next panel. We are slowly moving from geoeconomics to geopolitics. And the title of the present panel is NATO in Defense of Global Stability. I will start with introducing our very distinguished panelists. On the right from me is Jānis Garisons, who is the State Secretary of Ministry of Defense of Latvia. Mr. Garrison is with the ministry already for a very long time. He knows defense matters from inside very well, so therefore I'm very much looking forward for your expertise. And since we are here in Latvia, so the Baltic perspective is very much on our agenda. So the next speaker is Dr. Keller, who is representing Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and he is in charge of Foreign and Security Policy Program. Very experienced in security and defense matters, and if I may, so Dr. Keller came here 10 years ago when we started our Riga conference, and he was part of youth leadership initiative, so it's very nice that you are coming back now in the capacity of senior expert and sharing your views on NATO. The third speaker on our panel is General Sir Richard Sheriff, who is from UK, former Deputy Supreme Commander NATO Europe. So welcome, General. So we are very much appreciating your view on particularly NATO capabilities issues. The fourth chair for the time is empty, but it will not be empty for long because Ambassador Kurt Walker is on its way, so he was late flying into Riga due to weather conditions, and as soon as he will reach the library, he will join our discussion very quickly. So let me start, and of course I have also to remind that we are functioning and operating in a very cyber-friendly environment. So if people have questions who are following our discussion online, so you can send in your questions and your questions will be passed to our distinguished panelists. Well, we are ready to start. So the organizers of the conference very precisely indicated what is the state of affairs with NATO today. So NATO has to operate in a very difficult international environment. We tend to say security environment. I would say that today NATO is operating in insecure environment. And whatever geopolitical direction we are looking at, there are numerous threats, risks and challenges which NATO has to take and to respond. I would like to ask the first question to all of our panelists. What would be your diagnosis to the capability of NATO to deal with those numerous strategic issues which NATO has to respond these days? Could we start with some 4 or 5 minutes, your introductory remarks, and when you can proceed to more specific questions? Mr. Garrison, what would be your definition of the present state of affairs?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. But I think your question, probably the main question about global security and NATO role in global security is probably a little bit misleading. And I think it's been misleading for some time because what we actually lost formulating in that way NATO aims, we lost link with our society. We've been doing operations for years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Kosovo, and in de facto we were doing what we were doing. We were protecting security of our people, but the problem was, I think, that our societies have not understood, or they were not rightly explained that we are doing that in order to protect our main homeland. And I think what we have to talk about from now, and we are already doing it, how we protecting our people, because that is about NATO, what NATO is about, to protect our people and guarantee security of our people. Because the efficiency of NATO can be judged only by that, whether we can avoid or we can deter, whether there is a peace. Of course, you said I'm insider, and I know many things, but of course that additionally gives me some constraints, contrary to General Shirov, who is already out of NATO system and can speak more freely. But I think I would say that NATO is still the strongest military alliance, and it can protect its people. Of course, NATO only serves to political goals and political tasks, but actually societies and political masters gave to NATO and gave to military. Because it's of course directly linked to also budgetary issues. And if I have to judge developments of last year, I have to say that NATO been, even with all discussions that we had, NATO been quite efficient to change its focus from out-of-area operation focus on Afghanistan, where we spent a lot of years developing completely different capabilities. And during the 1 year's time, if we look what happens since last year's April, March, NATO changed, I would say, for 180%, and NATO were able to adopt completely new realities. And I remember those discussions before Wales. I have never actually, if I would had to take back in that time, I would never believe that we would be in a situation like now, when we have almost permanently rotating forces of different allies, where we have, of course, US troops here in Latvia, where we have permanently rotating air policing, enhanced air policing mission. And we have the biggest exercises in Baltics and also in the last decade of NATO. We have now tried in Junction. And it was interesting that we've been discussing many legal things in the ministry. Also, we had this tradition that we have to report to the government every exercise which goes above 500. Well, now apparently we have to report every exercise, because every exercise goes about 500 soldiers. And there is a complete different situation right now. And I, of course, you know, you can take glass half full or glass half empty. And I'm probably optimistic on that. The issue, I think, what NATO faces is about future, but I probably will leave future, because you might ask me later, because we have certainly some challenges, and especially preparing for Warsaw Summit. I think we've been quite successful addressing immediate and reacting immediately to change of security environment. Where I see the problem, and it's not actually military problem, it's more political problem, why we for several years on several occasions, we have not been able actually to predict that that security environment is changing. And that is not about NATO, it's about our general attitude and ability to look more in longer perspective. Because I remember in 2013, 12 or 13, when we've seen the trends that are actually developing along our borders, we've been actually, we rang the warning bells already at that time. And I have to say, we've been looked at that time as small forest freaks, because nobody believed us. What you are saying, we have a good relationship, we have, you know, everything is going very well. Why, you know, you are trying to disturb our good environment? I think this is a big issue, how to change our basically political immunity to see the changes coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure, one additional question to your introductory remarks. So out of area now is replaced by, or not replaced, by coming back to paragraph 5 classical tasks. Do you think that this balance between external and self-defense capabilities are kept?
Well, I think the issue is how you use those capabilities, and it's about strategy, because I still believe that NATO has sufficient capabilities, but the issue is about how to use those capabilities. Basically, what is our strategy? Do we have right strategy? Do we have right strategy to deter our enemies? That is the question.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Ambassador Walker.
Apologize for being late.
Happy that you are with us. So we are now going through the first round of comments. So my question was, what will be your diagnosis of the state of affairs of NATO with regard acting in global environments? So how NATO is coping with global security issues.
Sure.
So thank you. Dr. Keller, so what would be your assessment of the present state of affairs?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you for reminding everybody that it was 10 years ago that I was here for the first time with the Young Leaders program. I've been back many times since then, but today is the first time that I am allowed to speak here, and I think that's a particular honor, especially given the fact that today I'm neither young nor a leader, but still I'll try to do my very best on that. Maybe three things in response to your question. I think the three main challenges and the three main tasks for NATO today, also in the run-up to the Warsaw Summit. First remark, the first thing. I think we need to get the balance right between what you could call the eastern and the southern camp. Between those who believe that the main threat is Russia, Russian aggression, and those who believe that while this threat certainly exists, we should not forget about the Mediterranean and instability on our southern flank. I think we need to get this balance right. I think that especially a country such as Germany, which is located in the center, in the middle, between these two camps, if you will, has a special responsibility in making that work. I think we need to do all the obvious stuff. We need to reinforce our reassurance. We need to find a way to update the RAP, the Readiness Action Plan, in a way that it's more effective. In my personal opinion, the VJTF, the very rapid high readiness response force that we have, is too slow and too slim to actually fulfill its purpose. We should have a more persistent stationing and all these things. But having said all that, we shouldn't forget about the concerns of those that you could lump together in this southern camp. And I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to offer them something as well to reassure them as well that they are part of the alliance and that we take their worries and concerns seriously. I understand that this is a bit difficult because the Southerners have a harder time explaining what they actually want from NATO than the Easterners do. Maybe NATO is not the first, instrument in your toolbox that can deal with refugees and these things. But still, we need to be aware of that, and we need to find a way. Solidarity is something that works in, well, every which way when you look at the alliance. Second point. In relation to what the State Secretary just said, I think we need also to strike a proper balance between territorial defense and crisis management out of area. I think we can talk about that in more detail during the discussion, but I think in general we need to be able, as an alliance, to do both. There is not an either-or situation. It's not a zero-sum game. We need to do both. I understand that we currently have a special focus on re-emphasizing Article 5 and territorial defense, but I'm skeptical when people say that the age of crisis management is over because of the experiences we've had in Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere. In fact, this era of crisis management might just be beginning right now. I think if you look at the instability across the globe and around the globe, you can make that argument very well. And when we look at the refugee flows, something that we are all concerned about in Europe these days, you can see that maybe we will ultimately only have the choice to either export stability or to import instability. And if it really comes to that, then I think we need to be able to do crisis management out of area as well. And that, of course, has consequences then for our force planning and so forth. Third point, very briefly, if I may. I think that, and I think that's unusual to hear from a German, and I remind you that I'm not talking for the German government here, but rather as a, a think tank person. I think NATO needs to revisit its nuclear strategy, because ultimately the defense of our territory, especially in the east, depends not on the VJTF or a brigade here or there or whatever kind of stationing, but in the end it depends on a credible nuclear deterrence. And the Readiness Action Plan, for all its merits, was purely conventional in its outlook. It did not include nuclear things. The RAP was conventional, which is why some friends of mine call it crap. But I think it's important to include the non-conventional things as well. When we look at NATO strategy there right now, if we go back to the current document that is relevant for that, the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, I think it's so fraught with compromise that it's barely intelligible at times. And also it has a major flaw, and that is that it still sees Russia as a partner, which Russia, of course, today is not anymore. In fact, Russia is modernizing its nuclear arsenal, it's threatening with it, it's using nuclear signaling and all these things. And that means for us that we need to turn away from the way we handled nuclear issues in the past few years. We shouldn't continue to emphasize things like global zero or ending nuclear sharing or the rhetoric of deep cuts and all these. But in fact, I think, should talk about modernizing our nuclear forces and rethinking our strategy about first use capacity, deployability, all these really uncomfortable and touchy things, I think, need to be back on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keller. General, what would be your assessment?
Well, thank you. And I think there's a danger that we're going to be in violent agreement here. So I'll try and throw the odd comment out which might provoke a reaction. I think I'd like to start by reminding us that NATO is not some supranational organization. It is no more, no less than the 28 nations, the member nations who make it up. So, of course, there are inevitably tensions between national, domestic politics which impact on the ability of the organization as a whole to make decisions. NATO is, of course, a regional organization. You ask this question in a global context, but nevertheless, of course, it's a regional organization that faces global challenges, global security challenges, as do, of course, many of NATO's global partners. And it's worth remembering that NATO's been hugely successful recently on operations in Afghanistan, 28 member nations, as well as 22 partners from as far afield as Mongolia, Australia, New Zealand, as well, of course, as old friends Sweden and Finland. Libya, the operation, whatever happened in the wake of that operation, actually the operation itself included 4 Arab partners as a result of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative and the Mediterranean Dialogue. And of course that gives NATO an ability to get regional buy-in and regional legitimacy through those partnerships. So I think that's an area for NATO to work on, to develop. Partnership for Peace in its time, very valuable, probably long past its sell-by date, and needs to be looked at radically, perhaps a partnership for peace and security as well. But coming back to the challenges NATO faces, I think we can boil these down to 2. Number 1 is defense. Defense of the airspace, the sea lines of communication, and of course the territory of NATO. That is what NATO was set up to do, and NATO absolutely has got to continue to do that. And right now, the focus on the importance of Article 5, I don't think can be underestimated. Now, whether NATO can step up to the mark on that, I would say there's a long way to go. And I think there's a significant gap between the rhetoric we hear around the North Atlantic Council or the summit table and the reality on the ground. Now, I've been out of the main effort since I left. But as a soldier, I would be looking pretty carefully at the ability of NATO to actually reinforce, get boots on the ground, get capabilities to reinforce and protect particularly the Baltic states, given, of course, that NATO's strategic adversary has an air assault division 50 minutes flying time from Riga. Well, how can NATO react to that if it's got a very high readiness joint task force? And I know my successor as DSACO, as the force generator, is probably going to be ringing round saying, what happened to that battalion you promised us? And there'll be all sorts of humming and hawing in defense ministries. It's got to be, what is required is no more, no less than a fire brigade along the lines of the ace mobile force from the Cold War. And not only that, I absolutely second Dr. Keller's point about properly based troops here in the Baltic states. It's one thing to have exercising troops on rotation, but if I'm a defense planner sitting in Moscow, I'm just going to wait for the gap, and then I'm going to go for it. Okay, so that's important. The second aspect, and I also take your point about nuclear, it's got to be nuclear and conventional deterrence. And deterrence depends on capability, it's got to depend on credibility, and the alliance needs to be able to communicate that. And I think there's a long way to go before it can do that properly. The second challenge, of course, is security. The periphery of Europe, the instability, the Syrian civil war, the chaos in the Middle East, all impacting directly on the nations of NATO. And again, here, I think NATO has the capacity to step up to the mark, to confront and to think through the sorts of strategies that are needed. Because NATO is an international organization with an ethos, a command structure, a mechanism, a governance structure, which frankly is better than anything the world has ever seen before. The real challenge, though, is lack of ambition. And until NATO and the alliance members can step up to the mark, confront the challenges, not take counsel of their fears, then I think it has a chance. But right now, there's a long way to go.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Walker, what would be your assessment of NATO's role in defense of global stability?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here. It sounds like this is indeed going to be a NATO panel, which means that everything has already been said, but we're just going to keep saying it. I'll try to echo both points from Dr. Keller and General Sharif. But first off, when one looks around the NATO area today, we see really an unprecedented complexity and severity of crises. Syria coming apart with civil war, rise of ISIS, failed state in Libya, partly our doing, Russia having invaded neighbors, taken territory by force, continuing to occupy territories. And when you look at NATO, you don't really see much unity in understanding how we should handle these things. You don't detect a lot of will to take on these issues as NATO. You don't detect a lot of capabilities being dedicated to these crisis management efforts. There is, as General pointed out, a commitment to collective defense. Everyone, in a way, retreats to Article 5, territorial collective defenses. That's what NATO is supposed to do. That's what we do. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that simple. I think that to the degree that NATO fails to take on crisis management in its own neighborhood, it sends a signal about NATO's willingness to act, its credibility, as the General said, its will to deal with European security. If we think back after 1989, we deliberately laid a lot of architectural foundations for a post-Cold War order. Things like respect for the territorial integrity of countries, sovereignty, refraining from the threat or use of force, no changing borders by force, and all of these things enshrined in a lot of documents. A lot of other things, well, the CFE Treaty, the INF Treaty, Budapest Memorandum, and we've seen all of these things systematically torn up. And yet there hasn't been any coherent response from NATO to any of this. There's not a sense of clear unity of purpose and goal. There's not a sense of willingness to act. So while we may have small numbers of forces in, say, the Baltic states or Poland, deterrence rests on a combination of capability and will. And the capability is there but small, and the will is now doubted. And I would in fact argue that we're running into a very dangerous period now over the next year at the end of a US administration with other crises distracting us, that one can think that we will actually be tested on alliance territory now. If we have not dealt with Russia's changing this post-Cold War order in other places will be tested to see whether we will actually defend it with our allies. And then there's another point to this as well, which gets to the presence of forces, say, in the Baltic states or elsewhere. It is a good deterrent in the sense that it creates multinationality, it creates an operational capability, it complicates the planning for defense planners in Moscow. What's going to happen if I were to try something in one of these places? But the fact is, the capability of Russia near here is quite significant compared to anything that NATO could bring to bear in a short space of time, which means that NATO's response to such an aggression, if it were to occur, needs to be at a strategic level, not just a theater level. And that is not something that, as the General said, I don't think NATO is communicating that very effectively or very credibly, that if something were to happen here in the Baltic states, that it would be an issue for the United States and Germany and France and Italy with Russia, not just here locally in this territory. I think that needs to be communicated effectively because that's what deterrence really rests on. It's the collective solidarity of all of the allies acting together with an attack on one truly being seen as an attack on all. When we hear from NATO leaders the language of de-escalation and off-ramps, unfortunately, I think when you're in Moscow, what you hear is green light. And I think we need to change the messaging that we're giving from our own capitals and from NATO to show that there's much greater resolve. I don't doubt that we have the capability, but I am concerned that we don't have clear political will.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I would like to continue discussion, asking some additional questions referring to what you said partly and bringing some new topics on the agenda. I wanted to ask Mr. Garrison, so this afternoon I came back from Baltic Defense College where security in the Baltic Sea region was debated, and one of the questions which was asked by very many participants was, what about Swedish and Finnish potential NATO membership, whether it will increase, decrease regional, international, national security? So how you would deal with this issue?
Well, if you ask me, I would say it's a missing puzzle of this game. Of course, looking from our perspective, from pure in our national security perspective, membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO would solve probably many issues, because probably everybody here aware that the biggest problem of Baltics at this point is so-called possible anti-access area denial strategy that Russia might deploy here. And we've seen development of this strategy for years. And I remember when 3 years ago we went to U.S. Army War College and asked senior fellows to discuss this issue, how the issue might be dealt in the Baltics. They were looking, they accepted that might happen only in China, in South Pacific, not here. But we already progressed, I think, on that issue, and looking towards Warsaw Summit, I think we have to deal with this issue, how to tackle this anti-access area denial problem in the Baltics. And of course, Sweden and Finland plays, and Swedish and Finnish territory plays a very important role for that. But of course, it's Swedish and Finnish people who will vote, and it's not for us to decide, and they have to make choice. And I have sometimes double feelings whether there is a comprehensive understanding what this membership mean, because I'm here. I once was asked by a Swedish journalist, well, we signed this host nation support agreement, and have we got golden ticket into NATO? Well, I think this very clear, and I think Secretary General once already made it very clear. It's like collective defense. It's like, to some extent, pregnancy. Either you are or you're not. You can't be something in between. Yeah, you have to decide on that.
Thank you very much. I wanted to pass a question asked by Maxine David to Dr. Keller. And the question stands as follows. Has NATO efficiently adapted to the new reality given the past year's global events? So is it really acting corresponding to those changes?
Well, I think first of all, many were probably surprised by how quickly NATO adjusted in 2014 and that we actually came up with something at the Wales summit that was significant. What happened with the Readiness Action Plan, the whole reassurance package was not nothing. Especially from a German perspective, I think you can extend that assessment to the whole handling of the Ukraine crisis. I think some people were a bit surprised, not the least Vladimir Putin, at how staunchly the German Chancellor condemned his action in Crimea and how she supported sanctions and also then the reaction by NATO. Also, maybe as a footnote, I think it's very interesting to see how NATO reacted and adapted to this challenge, whereas the European Union did not at all, to my mind. The European Union's security and defense policy shows to me hardly any recognition of the new situation and the new threats that are there. So if you grade it on a scale and in comparison, I think NATO did very well. Now, of course, the key word, and you can debate that endlessly now, is sufficiently. What is sufficient? And then an alliance with 28 sovereign members and sovereign states, you will get, much disagreement about what is actually sufficient and what is not. And I think we will continue to discuss that in the run-up to the Warsaw Summit. I think, as I said in my introductory remarks, we have to be aware of the fact that Russia reacted to the RAP, to the Readiness Action Plan. Russia is finding ways of working around what we did in reaction to Russian aggression. So what we now need to do is to react to this counter-RAP by a counter-RAP, if you will, and become more sophisticated in our responses, and we have to think in more detail about that. So I think, yes, NATO did react sufficiently and is still doing so, is still in the process of doing so when it comes to Russian aggression. I don't think that NATO did enough so far when it comes to the challenges in the Mediterranean and in the broader Middle East, but granted, I think that's a more difficult thing to handle for NATO, as the reluctance of the individual member states to do something about these crises indicates.
Thank you. Yes, General, please.
I'm going to push back a bit, if I may, Dr. Keller, because I don't think that NATO did as well as it could have done. I remember the communique from there was all sorts of great talk out of the NATO summit last year, but for me it fell down on that we promised to try and reach 2% of GDP within 10 years. And that reminded me of the British government's 10-year rule of the 1930s. And it's not good enough, I'm afraid. The reality is that Europe, and also I have to say, I include in Europe in this case Canada, are not stepping up to the mark in terms of defense spending. 25 years ago, the split was pretty much, if you took the aggregate of NATO defense spending, it was pretty much 50-50 between the United States of America and Europe and Canada. Now it's something like 75% United States of America and 25% Europe and Canada. And at a time when we face the potential existential threat that we do, that simply is not good enough. Now, I know a number of nations have pledged themselves to increase 2% their defense spending, but it's not universal. A lot of nations need to do a great deal more, and one or two nations could do a lot better if they did not indulge in the sort of creative accounting that we see closer to my own shores back home. So that's one area. The second area I highlight is the reality of our lack of capability. So we should not be in any way be complacent about the capability of NATO forces by land, sea, and air to counter the sort of threat that Russia could put up against us. Because the truth is that the last 2 decades, in purely military terms, have seen a dismantling of military capability on a wholesale scale to meet pretty small, relatively speaking, small national contingents focused on expeditionary operations in counterinsurgency, some of which have seen some very bitter and nasty fighting, notably in Afghanistan and to a certain extent in Iraq as well. But these sort of pockets of little national forces sent out, this isn't joined-up warfighting capability. This isn't the ability to put together a war-fighting combined arms brigade capable of withstanding the real test of combat in a general war. And we need to be quite clear about that. It was Stalin who said, when reminded by one of his minions of the power of the Catholic Church, how many divisions as the Pope? The division still matters. NATO could not, I guarantee, put out a division, less the Americans possibly, but I bet you the nations of NATO in Europe could not put out a war-fighting division at anything less than about 6 months' notice. Now, I don't know the facts, but I tell you, we simply do not have the capability. So be under no illusions about the fact that the Emperor is rather lacking in clothes on this one.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Walker, I wanted to ask your stance on one of positions which was quoted in one of articles that the US role in Europe has changed from global power to European partners. So it used to be more engaged, now it's just a partner. Looking ahead of forthcoming presidential elections, so is US going to be for Europe power or partner?
Two thoughts very quickly. One of them is I don't think they're alternatives. You can be both a power and a partner. I would argue that in the best examples of American leadership are ones we've led with others, as opposed to trying to lead unilaterally. And so I think that that is what one would hope to see from any U.S. administration, is commitment and leadership and working closely together with our other allies so that we build a consensus, we build capability. I often like to say that if the U.S. doesn't lead, nobody else can. But at the same time, if the U.S. leads alone, we're not likely to succeed. So it's putting that together. What I think we've seen over the last several years is a U.S. seeking to pull back from engagement in conflicts around the world, pulling out of Iraq, pulling back substantially from Afghanistan, based more on timelines than on achievement, talking about a pivot to Asia, but not really increasing the presence in Asia. In fact, one of the things we're doing is moving Marines off of Okinawa further away from China, whether east to Guam or south to Australia, which doesn't look like a pivot to Asia, but a thinning away from China. And I think when we are just now seeing the U.S. pushing back on the islands in the South China Sea and the claims that China has put over territory and sea space there, now we're starting to see the U.S. push back on that a little bit. But this is 7 years into a pivot to Asia, what we haven't seen previously. I don't believe that this U.S. retrenchment will continue in a new administration, no matter whether it is the Republicans or Democrats who win. But let me qualify that by what I mean. I don't expect either of the two current frontrunners in the Republican primaries to win. Now, that is a dangerous prediction, that neither Donald Trump nor Ben Carson would actually prevail in the end, because I think Donald Trump has made clear that he shares some of President Obama's views about keeping the U.S. out, and we really don't know Ben Carson's views at all. Any of the other candidates that has a chance of winning, I think, would be very traditional in the mode of U.S. leadership, strong defense, and realizing that the best path to stability is to push back and create a balance of power, as opposed to pulling back and ceding either a vacuum or steps forward by another power. So that's how I see the role of the U.S. in Europe. I think the U.S. needs to be a European power with others. I'd like to make one other point, just having listened to some of the discussion here. We really do need to work on our language. We need to start putting in words like defense instead of just talking about deterrence. We need to talk. We need to stop saying reassurance and start talking about defense, credibility of defense, doing our job as an alliance. We need to actually have advocates for NATO. We have a lot of people who are advocates for the European Union when it comes to certain issues. Well, the EU needs to do this, the EU needs to do that. But we have a United States that views NATO as meaning Europe. We have a Europe that views NATO as meaning the United States. We have nobody saying when an issue comes up, NATO needs to do X. And I think we have to get back to seeing NATO as an actor that we should be advocating for. We need to be able to talk comfortably about defeating an adversary. That is a type of language that has, I think, vanished from Brussels discussions, that there is such a thing as an adversary, and that when you have one, your goal is to defeat them. That needs to be clear in order to give the right kind of guidance both to forces and to our publics and clarity among decision-making and political leadership. And then finally, these ideas that we always hear, there is no military solution. There's always a military solution. We may not like it. It may be one that's imposed on us, or it may be one that someone else imposes. The diplomacy can only follow the balance of forces. You can't, with diplomacy, compensate for a failing force posture or a failing balance of forces. So there's always some kind of military solution. The facts on the ground do matter. And then people talk about escalation as though it's a bad thing, when in fact it may be escalation that is necessary to convince an adversary that things have to stop and you create some stability. So we have to really work on our language, which I think if we get the language wrong, it clouds our strategic thinking and then we end up doing bad policy. So I think we have to talk clearly in order to get to the issues that are there in order to come up with the right strategic responses.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that this is a moment when representatives of constructivist school of international relations are applauding very loudly to you. So, thank you very much. Before giving floor to the audience to posing their questions, Dr. Keller wanted a quick comment on what was said.
Yeah, thank you. The constructivist might be applauding the concept, but maybe not the content of what Kurt was saying. But I fully support your point of view on language. I think that's really important. I wanted to briefly respond to General Sheriff's point about the 2% GDP, because I feel that we have at least a nuance of disagreement here. Let me first say, I fully agree with you. We need to spend more on defense. NATO-wide. For most of the countries that is true, only 5, I believe, meet the 2%, and we need to do much more on that. We need to invest in our hard power, and I think I've been saying that since I was a young leader. So in that sense, I'm happy that at least Germany managed to at least stop the downward trend in its defense budget, although my country, for instance, is far away from meeting the 2%. We are at 1.17, I believe. But at the same time, I understand those members of the German government who say it is not smart to focus that much on the 2% for numerous reasons. One reason is in Germany that would, just sticking to my own country, it holds true for others as well, it would never fly just for purely domestic reasons. A German defense budget that would meet the 2% with the strength of the German economy right now would mean an increase from around 30 billion a year, a bit more over 30 billion a year, up to almost 50 billion euros a year on defense spending. Now, I might like that, and many of my friends and strategists might like that, but I don't think you would get it through the German parliament at all. And by the way, I believe that many of the German allies who always, nudge Germany to do more would not like it either, because such an amount of defense spending would dwarf the capacities of the UK or France and other traditional powers, and it would reverse some of the dynamics we have in Europe, maybe with a bad outcome. So you can discuss this back and forth. I think it is smarter to focus not so much on the 2% but on actual output, on efficiency and investment. The 20%, I think, are much more interesting than the 2% when it comes on how do you use your money. And just, it's just a matter of experience. I believe that Germany, for instance, would never meet the 2% except we have a really great recession. I think that's the only way for my country to match that.
Bring it on, I say.
Mr. Garrison wanted a short remark.
Yeah, I actually want to a little bit argue with General Sheriff on NATO development, because I think we have to look a little bit into perspective, where we were when we started and where are we now. And of course, what I said, that we reached a lot since March of 2014. But of course, what we have to think about is what we are going to do in Warsaw. Because this, the Wales summit was about reacting to the sudden changes. And I, of course, said that it's pity that we were not able to predict those changes. In Warsaw, we have to think about how we adapt to current situation, because situation will not change. It probably will get worse. Therefore, it will be very crucial to decide in Warsaw what kind of forces we will have. And I think that what I already mentioned, what kind of strategy we will have. And you, Dr. Keller, rightly mentioned, because we have not only conventional, we have nuclear, and we have also missile defense. And we have all those forces available, all those tools in our box. And I completely agree with you, we don't use them properly. Because we can already, applying more language, more declaratory, using more declaratory policy, we can achieve much more even with current capabilities. But we have not done it. And I think this is a big challenge for Warsaw, actually, to push for future development. If we will not be able to agree on that, of course, I think that will be a big problem for NATO future. And for us, because of course we want to see more longer-term presence here and more longer-term solution for security of the Baltics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions, please. Where is the microphone? Even 4 questions. They are all. Let's start again geographically. Let's start with this side, and then we will move to that side. Yeah, please, let's start here. Yeah. Julian.
Thank you, Julian Lindley, French. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Initial comments, 2% is better than 1%, however you've added up. And I do fear that when we can't defend something, we simply organise a summit, and which is not entirely healthy. I want to get back to this issue of war. It's the elephant in the room. We talk around it, we talk under it, we never address it. I've just come back from Texas, where I was engaging with senior Americans, and I'm shocked by the impact of sequestration on the US military, on long-term defense planning in the US. I find it strange, given that the world in which we're moving into, where even considering the possibility of war in Europe is somehow taboo. Yes, war is unthinkable in Europe, therefore we better start thinking about it. And my concern is that there's an assumption in Europe that the United States will always be able to come over the horizon. When I look at the US military, I look at its commitments to Asia Pacific. If it had a major crisis in Asia Pacific simultaneously with a major crisis here, I'd be surprised if the US could really cover both. So my question to you all is this: how would we fight a war that broke out in the next 3 years? And have we abandoned the philosophy of worst-case planning upon which NATO was founded and designed to undertake?
Thank you. We will take several questions and then we will come back to answer. So there was a hand here and then it will come to you, General. It's here? Yeah.
Hello, Sergei Utkin, Russian Academy of Sciences. 2 questions, if I may, to General Shirov. You had an experience in various conflict areas where NATO was present. So do you think that the partnerships with non-NATO countries that existed in most of those conflict areas with the third countries which are not members of NATO are more like a symbolic thing, or they are a real asset? Is there a gap in interoperability if you speak about relations between NATO allies and the third countries present in the NATO operation, NATO-led operation? And a question to Patrick Keller. You probably know that one of the ideas on this kind of strengthening NATO in the East is that NATO is actually too complicated for that, and the easiest way is to have more US boots on the ground. Radoslav Sikorsky from Poland actually even speaks about necessity for Schengen area for US tanks in Europe. Do you have an opinion on that, and do you feel like German strategic community has a debate about that? Thank you.
Thank you. One more there and then here.
Thank you. Robert Dahlscher from Sweden. I get more and more signals coming out of DC saying that we are passing an inflection point. We have to realize that the post-Cold War period is ending and we are entering a period of confrontation, and that has implications for all kinds of things, including the Budget Control Act. Are these just minor changes in the weather, or are we seeing a strategic climate change?
And please hear the last from the first round.
Thank you. I'm Klaus Wittmann, Senior Fellow at the Aspen Institute in Germany and a former general at the Bundeswehr NATO. In 2009, Ron Asmus, who many in this hall have known, some others and myself, wrote a little study with the title NATO, New Allies and Reassurance. And in January 2010, Ron and I had the chance to brief the Albright Group at one of their workshops in Prague about it, and it contributed to rebalancing collective defense and out of area in the new strategic concept of November 2010. Alas, only on paper. And as the general pointed out, the pendulum swung very much to the side of out of area. Now, thanks to Putin, this is very topical again, and in a hurry we are doing what we failed to do in time. Still, and there comes my point, all this relates to the one side of NATO's ARMEL philosophy, defense and detente, firmness and readiness for dialogue, and I think this is still the right philosophy. Of course, Russia is an aggressor and not a partner at present, but I think Putin, or at least the people around him, must be made to understand how much he is acting against Russia's best interest, how he has led the country into a cul-de-sac. So I would ask all panelists, against the background of Wales and its implementation, do you see any chance to re-engage Russia, for instance, by re-energizing the NATO-Russia Council, which in my view, since the beginning of the conflict, should have been meeting almost in permanence?
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Quite wide range of questions, so who would start? Yannick?
Oh, I thought you would start with Kurt, but okay, I can start. Let's start with General Wittmann's question of NATO-Russia Council. I think it's a more conceptual discussion, and probably summit in Warsaw has to address it, what to do with actual NATO-Russia founding act. Because we know that Russia, since the war in Ukraine, broke a lot of principles and a lot of what is written in NATO-Russia founding act. Even, of course, we hear from Russian side that it's NATO who actually violated. But you know, let's go back and look. In reality, there is some principles and values what is written, what both sides agreed, including of non-violation of internationally recognized borders. Therefore, I think this is a wider issue of what is our strategy towards Russia. Because we, of course, can hide behind the curtain and wait for another summit, but I think at the end, we have to address the issue of, you know, basically, what is Russia? Partner or, I don't know. And that goes to the question of war. Of course, I already referred. I think we quite aware that the situation is not going to improve, and it's very clear on that. There are no signs that situation might improve, at least in this region. It will only can deteriorate. And therefore, of course, we have to think completely different ways how we address the issue, and probably be more open to our public And I have to say, I had already different experience. I was traveling, and the minister is traveling to schools now, to talking to pupils in schools. And I was surprised that there's still people are afraid of actually addressing the issue. I heard a lot of arguments, why are you talking about war? Let's talk about peace. And that is probably our fundamental issue what we have to deal with our society, because if you will not, if you are not going to address those issues to your society, basically you have a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keller.
Let me pick up on Sergei's question on what about the US just putting more troops on the ground in the eastern part of the alliance and be done with the whole issue. And what my opinion of that was. Well, first of all, I think the US should have an opinion on that. And I'm not so quite sure whether that's actually in the best interest of Washington to do that. Because as we've heard from Julian, there is a reluctance to engage in a way where Washington policymakers could say, well, actually that's something that the Europeans should do for themselves. We are happy to contribute and to support, but it's not something that we do for them. And I think I can understand that logic. The way I understand the official position of the German government, they stick, of course, to a rather narrow interpretation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, saying, well, even though Russia violated it, we will not, hence no permanent stationing of that kind. And therefore, we have other means of doing it. The VJTF, the multinational command in Szczecin, where the German government, of course, played a leading role. So I think that would be the official German position. My view is it's not about bilateralism. We are an alliance. It's not about the US doing something for individual member countries, but we have to do it together. Otherwise, we don't have the additional value that we cherish so much from NATO. We are not Asia-Pacific. We don't do it bilaterally. We do it as an alliance, and hence we should start doing it. And maybe one more thing regarding Klaus Wittmann. I have nothing against Pierre Armel, but I'm a bigger fan of Ronald Reagan. And I believe that you should negotiate from strength. And I think this is something that applies today as well. And when it comes to finding new channels of cooperation with Russia, I'm all for it. But I believe that the ball really is in Russia's court. And I think as long as the Kremlin and the current leadership in Russia don't change their ways, I think it will be darn difficult for us to do anything worthwhile.
Thank you. General.
I think if I can touch on three questions, which I think came specifically my way. Firstly, Dr. Lindley French, I absolutely agree that war is the word that nobody dare utter. We need to educate our people, our electorates, our governments, our ministers, that peace is not the default setting in international relations, that war is the default setting. And 101 years next, whenever it is, the 11th of November next week, after the outbreak of the First World War, is not a bad time just to dwell on the fact that at the end of the long peace, the sort of thunderbolt that hit Europe in between 1914 and 1918 was inconceivable at the time. How could Europe, so intertwined economically, socially, culturally, artistically, in every single way, how could that bloodletting ever happen? Well, it can, and we need to remind people of that. And the only way wars happen when people are weak and complacent and assume it can't happen. And the best way to avoid that is to be strong and to be prepared for that. And I fear, to answer your second part of your question directly, how would we fight a war in the next 3 years? I don't think we could. That's the fact. I really don't think we could because of the lack of capability, training, etc. The sort of exercises that are happening now or just happened, Trident Juncture, is a good start. Of course it is. But we need to be really serious about this. We need to be training in the way that we trained in the Cold War, government down to private soldier. The sort of command post exercises, decision-thinking exercises that engage the North Atlantic Council, that engage governments to think through, to develop the intellectual muscle memory, to challenge, to cope with the questions of what Article 5 means in this world of hybrid, asymmetric war, whether for all sorts of, all this, as well as the science of war that needs to be practiced and trained and resourced. So a long way to go there. On the question of partnerships, symbolic or effective, well, the answer is both. Symbolic, politically essential, because it binds in the greater the number of nations that are bound in politically, strength is gained from that. But also, I would say, for the specifics of the operations that I can think of, Afghanistan and Libya, no question that our partners added huge value in those areas. And the more we can, that's why I think NATO needs to continue to build on those partnerships and not lose the expertise, experience, contacts, friendships, comradeship, all those aspects that have been built up and hard won over the years. But we need to adapt those partnerships for the sort of combat and fighting that we might have to conduct in future. And then any chance of re-engagement with Russia. I hope to God we have got a chance of re-engagement with Russia. I think dialogue, as Churchill said, jaw is better than war. The more we can talk to Russia, the more we recognize that Russia is a great nation, we have to live with Russia. We have to find ways of living with Russia. But we must do it from a position of strength. So hold up the biggest possible stop sign in defense and deterrence terms to make sure that the dynamic that President Putin has started in Crimea and Ukraine comes nowhere near the boundaries of NATO. But at the same time, engage with Russia as an important player on the international scene, perhaps to talk about the challenges, to engage with them on a strategy for the Middle East, for example. But I certainly regret the fact that my successor as Deputy Sakar is not able to go to Moscow or receive visits from Moscow, as I was able to do, to be able to sit down with General Gerasimov and talk, because military-to-military contacts particularly are really important, because soldiers understand each other, as you know, only too well. So I think it's really important to find ways to re-engage with Russia, but to speak from a position of strength.
Thank you. Ambassador Walker, please, your turn.
Okay, I'll try not to repeat everything. I agree with much of what has been said, but not everything. To address specifically the question about the United States first, is there a sea change going on in our thinking? I think when you look at the number of senators who voted for a defense authorization bill, enough in the Senate where you could really anticipate being able to override a veto, that tells you something, that you have people from both parties that are not satisfied with continuing on the path that we've been on of the sequestration of defense spending. Now, it was vetoed by the president because it didn't address the overall budget issues in domestic spending. But I think there is, on the defense side, something of a change, something of a real change, that we have gone too far in the wrong direction and need to turn it around. And I do think in a new administration, again, whether it's Hillary Clinton, the most likely Democratic candidate, or one of the mainstream Republican candidates, I think you'd see that change even more manifest. To the question about our capabilities in winning a war, I kind of agree with both the General and Julian Lindley French, and I kind of don't agree. I think if you look at NATO's, as a whole, the 28 nations' collective warfighting capability, I would have to agree with the points that you're making. That's not quite there. If the United States was all in a conflict in Europe, we would win that conflict. There's no question. And that gets to the point that there is this issue of European contributions to European defense. It's insufficient and it needs to be higher. The real issue, however, if you look strictly at winning a war, is decision making. I have a hard time believing that we would decide to win a war. I think the US would decide that this is really a European problem. I think Europe would decide that, well, is it really worth it? Or what are we losing here? Or maybe we can negotiate something out of this, and not negotiating from a position of strength. That's the risk. Even in the best of scenarios where we do decide that we want to win, the mechanisms and time that we would take to do so might actually be self-defeating as well. As the Secretary General has recently said, what's the point of having I believe it was the Secretary General, if I have it wrong, I'm sorry, but what's the point of having a response force that can act in 48 hours if you can't even get the NAC meeting scheduled in 48 hours, let alone make a decision, which can take weeks. I think our actual clarity of our goals and our collective will and decision making is our weakest point. I said that earlier, and I want to repeat it. Concerning NATO-Russia, now here I am an outlier on this. We've tried really hard. We created the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We set out all of these areas of cooperation that we wanted to open up for working with Russia, including the mill-to-mill contacts, but things like search and rescue at sea and peacekeeping doctrine and theater and missile defense. We talked about common threat assessments. We've done exchanges with them. We've participated in certain peacekeeping exercises. They've been in some of the operations, such as K4 or S4. We amplified that with the NATO-Russia Council that was formed in 2002 at the summit in Practica de Mare. There was an effort Russia was complaining that it didn't feel like it was being treated as an equal. So we sat them around the table in alphabetical order as opposed to NATO and Russia. We opened up still further areas of cooperation. And what we've seen overall, and particularly as a steady progression under Vladimir Putin, is that Russia is not interested in working with NATO. Russia prefers to see NATO as an enemy in order to justify its authoritarian government at home, its defense expenditure, and its aventurism in the near abroad. And so having NATO as a partner would not make sense if that is what you're trying to do. So they deliberately do not want to work together with NATO. Therefore, getting back to language, we have to stop saying we need to find ways to work together with Russia. Russia needs to find ways to work together with the rest of the world. It's not on us to change normal behavior to accommodate Russia's authoritarianism and adventurism. We have to turn the tide on that.
Thank you very much. And before giving floor to the other side of the audience, I will give a short moment for Yanis Garisons to respond.
Yeah, I felt just, again, need to a little bit argue with the general, because I think, you know, I don't want to leave this audience with a very grim picture, because I think, of course, there are a lot of things to do to improve our capabilities, but the issue is two facts. One, I think we are a little bit overestimating our enemies. They are not 7 foot tall. They have their own vulnerabilities, and we can exploit those vulnerabilities. One. The second point is our aim is not to actually fight war. Our aim is to deter war. And I think we still have sufficient capabilities to do that. But as I said already previously, we need the right strategy for that to deter. And I'm historian myself by education. I'm read a lot of books, and I know that almost in all wars, generals never ready for war. But in most of them, generals fought. And look on Ukraine. And I think we will fight this war if we're forced to do that. Because in Ukraine, nobody expected Ukrainians would do so good. And actually, I think Russians didn't as well. But look what happens. I think the picture is not so grim. We capable of doing many things, but of course we have to change, be able to face challenges in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we can take questions from that side of the audience. Sorry, I'm afraid we will not be able to pick all of them because we have only 15 minutes left and one substantial question still pending. So let's start. We'll come back to here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dinesh Nagy, International Circle of Hungary. As you might be aware, in January 2016, the Visegrad 4 countries will be launching a permanent battle group. Now, this is a new way of finding a way to have these regional groupings which could hopefully create an effective permanent force that could be rapidly deployed. What are your thoughts on developing such regional groupings, for example, a Baltic grouping and other such groups in order to find this sort of rapid response force that we're looking for?
Two gentlemen here. Please pass the microphone here.
Thank you. Balkan Devlen, Izmir University of Economics, Turkey. My question to the panelists is, how do we deal with the concept within the Russian nuclear doctrine of using tactical nukes as a weapon of de-escalation? Do we have a plan, or are we back to 1950s and the massive retaliation? Thank you.
Masai Ishii, Ambassador of Japan to NATO. Two quick questions. First question is about defense budget. For me, this is not less of the issue of 2% or 20%. This is more the issue of the 75 versus 25. And whoever comes in as the next president of the United States, this is not politically sustainable. So the question is to the European panelists is, what should and can Europeans do in concrete terms to change the situation? Second question is about the South. We haven't talked too much about it. What should and can NATO do in the South? Not much, or Mediterranean, or going back to Libya, or going even to the Sahel countries. Because issue is, if you leave the situation as they are, you end up creating a situation where only the United States can make difference, which we don't want to see.
Thank you. There was 2 minutes question. Quick one. Two-finger question. No, over there. Yeah. Behind. Yeah.
My name is Hans Benendijk from Johns Hopkins University and the RAND Corporation. I just wanted to make it very clear that I believe the Obama administration fully is committed to Article 5. We have the strongest military in the world in the United States. We have been fighting with that military for 15 years. We are well-trained, well-equipped. And so it would be a mistake for this audience to believe, or for that matter, for President Putin to believe, that the United States is not committed to Article 5. President Obama has been here in the Baltic states to make that point. Our EUCOM is very busy now doing multiple exercises. I do think there is one scenario that I worry about, and that was what Julian mentioned, and that is that we are actively engaged in a major fight somewhere else in the world. That's the scenario that Europe needs to think about, not the fact that we don't have the will to be here when needed. I would also point out that, read Article 5. Article 5 commits individual nations as well as all nations to come to the aid of somebody under armed attack. That means the United States and a small group of partners could act alone if the NAC delays. That's an important element of Article 5, and it's an important element of deterrence. So our Budget Act was just passed. It increases is correct. Sequestration on defense is basically over, if I understand it correctly. So we are moving back in the right direction. We don't want to leave any misimpression here that the United States isn't going to live up to this commitment.
Thank you. Sorry for not giving floor to all of those who would like to ask questions and comments, because we have only 10 minutes left. So diverse questions. I would encourage each of you to pick the ones which you really would like to respond, because in the end we still have to answer the question which was asked by Carl Bildt, and which is also on my list: what to expect from Warsaw Summit in the end. Probably you could finish your question with your expectations from Warsaw Summit. So now we could start with Ambassador Kurt-Walker. Yanis, you didn't want to be the first one, so.
Okay, great. I think to respond first to Hans and his point, I think he's absolutely right. In a clear-cut scenario where you have a direct, incontrovertible military attack on a NATO ally, U.S. is clearly committed to responding. But there's a whole range of ambiguity before you get to that, where it's not clear. And that's where I worry we would be tested, and I worry there would be a lot of discussion about what does it really mean and how do we really respond. And I think it is dangerous. We certainly have the capability, and in a clear-cut scenario, we could certainly prevail. It's that ambiguity of political decision-making that's a worry. On nuclear weapons, that's a very, very tough problem because it is part of Russia's doctrine. I think we're going to have to ask, as Julian suggested, get our defense planners to think through the worst-case scenarios, and how do you try to create conditions that give us an advantage even in a worst-case scenario. We don't have it. We don't have such a strategy right now, for sure. The regional groupings, all in favor. Any additional capability and usability is good, just however you put it together. Before I get to the Carl Bildt question, then, we left off one issue or a couple of issues here I want to bring up before we close, which is NATO has not only done operations, doing collective defense, dealt with partners. NATO has also had a process of building a Europe whole, free, and at peace. It has enlarged, it has incentivized the right kinds of democracy, market economy, reform. We will probably at the Warsaw Summit have an invitation to Montenegro to join. I hope that's the case. But we also have seen NATO and the EU either at best passive and at worst really putting their head in the sand on the direction of reform, democracy, and European integration to a wider Europe, as we used to say, to talk about Georgia, to talk about Ukraine, to talk about Moldova. I guess those are all the night owl sessions this evening. Those are still important. And what we've seen is Putin is very deliberately attacking in these areas, and literally attacking in these areas, militarily, politically, energy, criminality, intelligence services, in order to assert Russian dominance in the former Soviet space and to deflect any potential further Western thinking about there being a Europe whole, free, and at peace. This is both to stop the progress of these countries toward establishing their own successful identities, and also a means of justifying his own kind of rule in Russia. So I think we need this on the agenda for Warsaw. It needs to be on our national agendas. We never finished the job. The people in Europe's East have just as much right to having a strong national identity, a democratic society, a market economy, and security, just as much right as people in Europe's West. Now, that being said, I also have to say I'm going to start calling Georgia the land of the Kevlar feet, because they manage to shoot themselves in the foot so often and keep going. It is remarkable. And the most recent things are with the use of the judiciary on some of the politically targeted prosecutions, with the Rustavi television that has just faced a court decision the other night. We all want to see Georgia succeed and to see it move in this direction, but frankly, Georgia is not helping itself as much as it should and could. And with Ukraine, it's a little bit more understandable. They've always had difficulties with governance and corruption ever since they became an independent state. But now they are really under direct attack from Russia and really need some direct support, although they also need substantial reform. These are the issues that I would suggest for Warsaw then. The wider Europe has got to be on there as one. Where are we going? Crisis management. We talk a lot about defense and collective defense and Article 5 because we're comfortable with that. But if we don't deal with crisis management, we're going to have to do collective defense, unfortunately. And then finally, strengthening what collective defense actually means. Responding only in a tactical and the aim of de-escalation way is, in fact, as I said, it's a green light to Putin. We need to make sure that we are prepared to respond strategically if we're challenged on collective defense.
Thank you. General.
Regional groupings, of course, a good thing. But to be effective, they've got to be rigorously organized, trained, and tested to meet the real challenge of war. It's no good having a combined battle group that might look good. It's got to be really, really effective. And that's what I worry about, because the more you go down to subunit, company, section, platoon level in multinational terms, the more complicated it gets. People need to talk to each other, they've got to have the right radios, the interoperability, the logistics, all the stuff that makes up a warfighting capability. So just beware of window dressing is what I'd say. Then the challenge of how you cope with tactical nuclear weapons as a de-escalatory measure, nuclear blackmail. Well, I think my answer would be don't go there. And that comes back to ensuring that we have a credible and a coherent and a capable deterrence capability, both nuclear and conventional as well. And that, again, requires us to be strong, and we've said enough about that already. How does Europe change to meet the challenge? And I think we've again talked about that, and I won't repeat myself to say that Europe has got to recognize the threat it faces, and our electorates and governments need, therefore, to understand that. And I fear that we're in the reality is, certainly in Western Europe, that Western European countries have now got themselves into a position by design or default where higher defense spending at the expense of social welfare spending is unacceptable to electorates, unacceptable to politicians, and therefore, unless and until those electorates and politicians are frightened and recognize the threat, that won't change. What can NATO do more in the south? Well, I think a great deal more. NATO is an exceptionally capable organization if it wants to be, and it comes back to that issue of lack of ambition. A fixed command structure, all the capabilities it needs. Where is NATO on the refugee crisis that is impacting on Europe? NATO has the means. Now, of course, crisis management is essential, but I think much better, and this in a sense is the challenge of the age, how much better to prevent the crisis from happening in the first place through upstream security building, through comprehensive capacity building. The sort of model of the NATO training mission in Iraq, for example, a relatively small multinational team really contributing to the stability, political stability in Iraq until it was pulled out through professionalizing armed forces. But of course it's much wider than that. And this is where NATO and EU need to work together, and indeed with other organizations. Genuine capacity building across the board. Military, yes. Security service reform, security sector reform, yes. Law and order, governance, anti-corruption, building up effective administrators. That is the area I think NATO can contribute in its own way too. The final point, what should we expect from the Warsaw Summit? Well, I think there's a difference between what we'll get and what we should expect. What we should expect is a rigorous gap analysis looking at what was set in 2014 at Wales, what has been achieved, where are the gaps, and what needs to be done. I fear that what we'll get is it's all wonderful, aren't we clever?
Thank you. Dr. Keller.
That was almost a closing statement.
No.
And it's, of course, very difficult to add something original now, but I will try to do maybe on 2 points. First, the colleague from Hungary on the Visegrad 4 battle group. I think this is a good thing, especially in the context of the European Union, where you don't have the kind of centralized organizational schemes, and therefore you need more of these islands of cooperation. But I think the Visegrad 4 also, like others, is an example of how vulnerable these kinds of cooperations are to political differences between those, in this case, 4 countries, because that will then affect defense as well, even though the differences might stem from other issues as well. This is something that is not as much the case within the NATO structure as a whole, because there you always have the US in the room and at the table, which is why I believe that there you can do more things, alliance-wide, and with the US as kind of, somebody to keep things together, which is why I, on these defense issues, always prefer NATO as a framework over the EU. On the ambassador's question about the South, I think that's one of the key problems in the run-up to the Warsaw Summit. It's a pity that we don't have a speaker here from Italy or Spain, because then we could have asked them, what is it that you want NATO to do? And as I said before, I think it's very difficult to be specific about that for them. So maybe just two things. First, the refugee crisis is affecting NATO now as well, and the coherence of NATO. Although I believe it is primarily an EU problem, something that the EU should solve. But because of the many disagreements and disappointments on that issue within the EU, these are being carried over now into NATO discussions, which is a problem, and we need to be aware of that and need to at least realize that. And then second of all, I completely agree with what the General just said about seeing NATO not just as an organization that can do operations, but also as a political instrument. And I think the first step in when it comes to politics is that we need to accept that the partnership programs of NATO for the region, the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative are, well, face it, they are dead. They don't work. They don't, bring much use to us. And we need to think about new ways of doing that, to do all the things the General just described and to bring more stability, capacity building and these things to these countries. Which leads me to the answer to the Warsaw question, what do we expect or what's going to happen there? My hope is that the Warsaw Summit will not be all about Russia all the time. I understand that this is important, and all the things we talked about here on this panel, they are important, but we shouldn't limit our NATO discussions to that, especially in our public communication afterwards. NATO is about more. It's about the partnerships I just mentioned. It's about, as Kurt said, the enlargement process, which is why I think that the Montenegro thing is a good development. And we need these talking points also after the Warsaw Summit for all those countries who are more reluctant to engage in the Russia bashing, if you will, because then it's easier for them to sell achieved compromises to their domestic audiences afterwards when they can point to something else as well. And it's not just the reinforcement of the VJTF and these things. So I think it would also be a tactical advice to not do Russia all the time when it comes to Warsaw.
Thank you. Jani, now it's your turn.
Yes, probably I will start with rapid response. I think the Baltic countries have been very rich in our experience when it comes to joint units. And as we speak right now, our joint Baltic battalion is deployed in Trident Juncture exercise in Spain. And it was actually the first time when Baltics deployed and took logistics in our own hands. And we also participate in UK-led joint expeditionary force, which will have also improve our interoperability. But I think it doesn't solve our issues. As we already discussed, the rapid response forces are actually efficient when you deploy it in the right time. And it's not about Article 5, it's about actually Article 4. And then the question is, are we able to take political decisions in the right time and say, yes, this is the right time to deploy? And that, I think, is a big issue with rapid response forces. And I certainly want to comment on defense budgets. I'm afraid we inventing different things, smart defense, whatever in the EU it's called, to justify why we don't need to spend on defense. And I can say either we have money or either we don't have money, because you can't do the same with less. It doesn't work simply, because, and I can say right now we have around 10 or 13% of investments, and we next year with a big increase, our number will go up immediately to 25% in investments. You can't achieve with a small budget the same numbers because you simply don't have money. On Warsaw, I already said, I think for us, what is important, not only analyze what has been achieved. From our perspective, there's been a lot achieved. NFIU, reinforcements, exercises. I think we have to go further on and look what is the long-term solution and how we cope with in the future. We have to, as I said, and of course for us it's about long-term credible military presence in the Baltics, because, as I said, there is a risk of that rapid response concept might not work in the future. And of course, Russia and probably posture review as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wrapping up our discussion, which was very rich, diverse in topics and views, I would like to pick only a few points. And if I go to the graphic way, then it would sound like that one. So NATO has to stick to paragraph 5. Strategize nuclear and conventional, it was mentioned deterrence, probably now defense. To secure a neighborhood, but also secure our own coherence and credibility. And also the word balance was mentioned several times, and it refers to balance of interests of NATO member states, balance of territory, the territorial defense, and also out of operations area. And last but not least, to learn language. And I think that we can learn this language relatively quickly. The question is whether others will understand and speak along the lines of our language. So therefore, this question is still open. I have one announcement to make. So everybody is invited for dinner, and dinner is going to take place on the other side of the hall. And I would like to invite for a round of applause to thank our participants.
Great.
Thank you. Yes.
Love you, baby.